On the night of the 30th of January, 1945, a German passenger ship was moving slowly westward through a snowstorm in the Baltic Sea. She was 9 decks high. Her name was Wilhelm Gustloff. Her lights were on. She had been built for cruise tourism. She was designed to carry around 1,500 passengers in comfort. On this particular night, there were close to 10,000 people on board. Almost half of them were children. At 16 minutes past 9 in the evening, a Soviet submarine called the S-13, watching from beneath the storm, fired 3 torpedoes at her port side. The torpedoes had been hand-painted with Russian dedications. For the Motherland. For the Soviet people. For Leningrad. 60 minutes later, the Wilhelm Gustloff was gone, on her side at the bottom of the Baltic. An estimated 9,343 people died with her. That is roughly 6 times the death toll of the Titanic. In our last episode, we told the story of the deadliest peacetime maritime disaster in history. Tonight is the deadliest, period. There is no second place that is close. There is also, almost, no public memory of it. This is the story of why. To understand how 9,000 people came to be on a single ship in a Baltic snowstorm, you have to understand the strange, propagandistic origin of this vessel. The Wilhelm Gustloff was launched on the 5th of May, 1937, at a shipyard in Hamburg. Adolf Hitler attended the launch. So did the widow of the man the ship was named for, Wilhelm Gustloff himself, a leader of the Swiss branch of the Nazi Party who had been assassinated the year before. The ship was meant to be a floating advertisement. She belonged to a state program called Kraft durch Freude, Strength Through Joy. The idea was simple. German workers, properly screened for racial purity, could buy a Baltic cruise or a Norwegian fjord trip for the price of a few weeks' wages. The Rye would pay the rest. In her 2 years of crew service, she carried about 65,000 passengers on roughly 50 voyages. Madeira, Norway. Lisbon. In 1939, she also helped repatriate German volunteers from the Spanish Civil War. Then the war began. In September 1939, the Gustloff was painted white with red crosses and turned into a hospital ship. By 1940, she was repainted naval grey and tied to a pier at Gotenhafen, on the Polish coast, where she became a floating barracks for the German submarine school. For 4 years, she sat at that pier. Her boilers cooled. Her dance hall echoed. Anti-aircraft guns were bolted to her promenade deck. By the start of 1945, she had not moved under her own power in more than 4 years, and her hull had become part of the port itself. That same January, on the other end of the war, something enormous was happening on land. The Red Army had broken through the German lines in East Prussia. Königsberg was nearly surrounded. The road to Berlin was open. In front of the advancing Soviet armies, an entire population was running for its life. German farmers, families, children, the elderly. They packed wagons in the dark. They walked in temperatures of -20 degrees. Some of them crossed the frozen Frisch's half lagoon on foot, with horses falling through the ice. In the last days of January, Admiral Karl Dönitz issued the order for a project he had been quietly preparing. It was called Operation Hannibal. Its goal was to take German troops out of the eastern Baltic, and to take refugees if there was room. Over the following 4 months, Operation Hannibal would move close to 2 million people across the Baltic Sea, away from the Soviet advance. It is, by some distance, the largest maritime evacuation in history. Roughly 4 times the size of Dunkirk. Almost no one outside Germany has heard of it. The Wilhelm Gustloff was one of the ships called back into service. After 4 years of stillness, her engines were warmed up. Her sailing crew was scratched together from naval auxiliaries and old hands. On the 30th of January 1945, she was ordered to sail from Gotenhafen to Kiel. 4 days before she sailed, refugees had been arriving at the Gotenhafen pier on foot, on horse-drawn carts, in trains. They had walked from inland villages with whatever they could carry. They had heard there was a ship. The Gustloff's design capacity was around 1,400 passengers. Including her wartime crew, the realistic limit was perhaps 2,000 people. The manifest signed off that morning listed 6,050. The manifest was already a polite fiction. As the ship took on coal and water, women with infants pushed through the crew lines on the gangway. Wounded soldiers were carried up on stretchers. Children without parents were lifted onto the deck and waved through. The most credible post-war reconstruction, by the Gustloff's own former purser Heinz Schön, who survived the night and spent 50 years investigating it, put the real total at 10,582 people. Among them, nearly 5,000 were children. Inside the ship, every room had been converted. The drained swimming pool held 373 young women of the Naval Auxiliary Corps, sleeping on mattresses laid across the tiles. The dance hall held refugees on bedrolls. The cinema. The maternity ward. Every corridor. 4 captains argued on the bridge that morning. 2 of them, civilian merchant captains, wanted to stay close to the shore and to sail slowly behind a minesweeper escort. 2 of them, naval officers, wanted to run far out to sea and to use the ship's speed against submarines. The compromise was almost the worst of both choices. They would take the deep water route, where submarines lived. But they would sail at only 12 knots, slow enough to be caught. At 12:30 in the afternoon, with snow blowing horizontally across the harbour, the Wilhelm Gustloff cast off her lines. Below the surface of the Baltic, another captain was already watching her. His name was Alexander Marinesko. He was 31 years old. He was Ukrainian. He commanded a Soviet submarine called the S-13. Marinesko was not a model officer. A week earlier, on shore leave in Finland, he had disappeared into the bars of Turku for 2 days and missed his sailing orders. He was, at that moment, expecting a court-martial as soon as he returned to port. He was looking for something dramatic to bring home. The S-13 had been patrolling the Baltic for days without finding a target. Then, in the early evening of the 30th, the submarine's lookouts saw lights on the dark horizon. A large ship. Lit up. Moving slowly. The lights had been turned on by the German captains for a specific reason. Naval radio had warned of friendly minesweepers crossing their path in the storm. In zero visibility, the Gustloff lit her running lights to avoid colliding with her own side. It was a careful choice. It was also fatal. Marinesko followed her for almost 2 hours. Then he made an unusual decision. Instead of attacking from the seaward side, where any escort would be expecting him, he surfaced his submarine and ran around to the landward side, where the shallower water made attack less likely. From there, he turned in. At 9:16, he fired 4 torpedoes. Each one had been painted with words. The first read for the Motherland. The second, for the Soviet people. The third, for Leningrad. The fourth, for Stalin, jammed in its tube and never left the ship. The first 3 ran true. The first struck the Gustloff's bow, where most of the off-duty crew were asleep. Watertight doors slammed automatically. The men who knew the ship best were trapped in the dark and went down with the section. The second torpedo struck the empty swimming pool on E deck. The 373 young women of the Naval Auxiliary Corps, asleep on the tiles, were killed almost instantly by the blast and the rush of seawater into a flooded cement bowl. The third torpedo struck the engine room. The lights went out. The ship's whistle, her radio, her emergency power, her steering, all of it went dead in a single moment. The Wilhelm Gustloff began to list to port at a steep, irreversible angle. The ship did not sink immediately. She had 60 minutes left. 60 minutes for 9,000 people to find a way out, in the dark, in a snowstorm, on decks that were tilting more steeply every second. The corridors had been packed tight before the torpedoes hit. Now the floor was sliding underneath them. People who had been sleeping rolled. Children disappeared in the press. Old women lost their grip on the rails and went past in the dark. The lifeboats had been stowed in their davits since the autumn. In 4 months of harbour cold, the launching mechanisms had frozen solid. Sailors hacked at them with axes. Some boats came free. Others stayed locked in place as the ship rolled past them. There were not enough lifeboats anyway. The Gustloff carried life-saving capacity for around 5,000 people, on a good day, with a trained crew. There were 10,000 people on board, in a panic, in the worst weather of the year. In the first-class corridors, survivors later remembered, a German officer pulled a pistol. He shot his wife, then his children, then himself. They were not the only family that died that way. The decisions made on the Gustloff in those minutes were not the decisions people make in their actual lives. Mothers in the lower decks pushed children up through hatches and into the arms of strangers in lifeboats, then stood and waved as the boats fell away. There were not enough places. There were not enough adult hands. Many of the children in the boats had no one with them. The air temperature that night was around -18°C. The water temperature was just below freezing. People who fell into the Baltic in that condition lasted, on average, 5 to 15 minutes. They did not drown. They froze. A young German seaman named Werner Fick later said that he stopped trying to remember faces after the first hour, because there were too many, and he could not separate the dead in the water from the living. He swam in circles in the dark, pulling whoever moved. At around 10 past 10, the Wilhelm Gustloff rolled completely onto her port side. Her stern lifted, briefly, into the snow. Then, in less than a minute, she slipped beneath the surface of the Baltic Sea. Where she had been, there were now only rafts, debris, and the people in the water. The escort vessel, a torpedo boat called the Lerve, was already pulling survivors out before the ship was fully gone. Other ships in the convoy radioed for help. Over the course of the next few hours, 9 German vessels reached the area. The torpedo boat T-36 rescued 564 people. The Lerve rescued 472. 3 minesweepers and a freighter took out 170 more. In total, about 1,252 people came out of the water alive. A few of them died on board the rescue ships from exposure and shock. One of the survivors was an infant, perhaps a year old, found alive in a lifeboat in which every other person was dead. He had been wrapped in coats. He was given to a petty officer on the patrol boat that found him, and grew up in a German family without ever knowing for certain who his parents had been. Roughly 9,343 people did not come out of the water. Most of them were never recovered. The Baltic in winter does not give its dead back. Of the nearly 5,000 children on board, around 100 children survived. That same night, the Soviet S-13 sailed away into the storm. Marinesko did not surface again to count survivors. 9 days later, he would torpedo another evacuation ship, the General Steuben, and kill 3,600 more. On the German side, the loss was not reported. Joseph G. Goebbels personally ordered the news suppressed. The 30th of January was the 12th anniversary of Hitler's rise to power. He gave a radio address that evening. He did not mention the Wilhelm Gustloff. Most Germans never knew that night what had happened. On the Soviet side, the loss was also not celebrated. Marinesko was returning to port under the threat of court-martial. His commanders did not want to give credit to a captain they had been preparing to discipline. He was not made a hero of the Soviet Union. He was given a lesser decoration, and quietly demoted. A few months later, the war in Europe ended. Within a year, the Soviet Union had taken Königsberg, renamed it Leningrad, and pushed every surviving German civilian westward out of the territory. The people who had been on the pier at Gotenhafen, the people who had been on the Gustloff, were no longer a population that anyone counted. In the new East Germany, Marinesko was officially a Soviet ally hero. Talking about the Gustloff was uncomfortable. In the new West Germany, talking about German civilian deaths felt, to a generation rebuilding under the shadow of Auschwitz, like an evasion of what had been done in their name. So no one talked. For decades, the story lived in 2 places. In the private memory of the survivors, and in the work of one man, Heinz Schön, the Gustloff's former purser, who survived the sinking and then spent the next 50 years interviewing every other survivor he could find, and assembling the count that all credible histories now use. In 1990, just before the Soviet Union dissolved, President Mikhail Gorbachev posthumously rehabilitated Alexander Marinesko and named him a hero of the Soviet Union. By then, Marinesko had been dead for over 25 years. He had died of cancer in Leningrad, in poverty, in 1963. In 2002, the German novelist Günter Grass, a Nobel laureate, a man who had been a 15-year-old in the Hitler Youth in 1945, published a novella called Im Krebsgang, Crab Walk. Its subject was the Gustloff. It broke a silence that had lasted nearly 6 decades. There is no Wilhelm Gustloff memorial in Berlin. There is no monument in Gudden. There is no Hollywood film. There is no annual television documentary on a major American channel. There is, at last count, one online museum, run by a Canadian descendant of survivors out of his own pocket. There are reasons for this silence. The most important one is unavoidable. The same week the Gustloff went down, 600 kilometers to the south, Soviet troops were walking through the gates of Auschwitz-Birkenau. The German state was, at that exact moment, still operating the largest extermination apparatus in human history. To mourn the Gustloff publicly, in the years after the war, felt to many people like an evasion. As if naming 9,000 German dead would somehow soften the 6 million Jewish dead that the German state had murdered. So the world chose, by tacit agreement, not to name them. The historian's job is harder than that agreement. History allows for two true things at once. A state can be the perpetrator of an unforgivable crime, and some of its civilians, especially its children, can still also be victims of a separate cruelty in the same war. Both of those things are true of Germany in 1945. Today, the wreck of the Wilhelm Gustloff lies on her port side in about 44 meters of water, off the coast of what is now Poland. The Polish government has declared the site an official war grave. Diving is prohibited. The ship is still down there, in the dark, with most of her dead. Among those dead were almost 5,000 children. A child too young to have voted for the regime that built the ship she was on. A child too young to have understood the war that killed her. A child whose only mistake, on the 30th of January 1945, was to have been carried up a gangway by a mother who was trying to save her. The deadliest shipwreck in human history was not the Titanic. It was not the Lusitania. It was not even, as we saw last episode, the Donwaye Pass. It was a former Nazi cruise liner full of refugees, torpedoed in a snowstorm, on the night of the 30th of January, 1945. If you have never heard her name, that is not an accident of memory. It is the result of a long, careful, almost unanimous silence, kept by the country that lost her, by the country that sank her, and by the rest of us, who needed her not to complicate the story we had already chosen to tell about that war. In the next episode, we will travel to another sea, and to a more recent year, and to a ship that went down where every camera in the country could see it, and where the silence afterwards turned out to be just as long. Subscribe so you don't miss it.